Shaq. Besides my teammates, my wonderful teammates, Shaq, Lamar, Elton, my friends. There's many of those guys. My number's not out there like that.
Right.
But then I seen guys like Drew Gooden said some things on TV. And a lot of guys had my back, so that was cool.
What did Shaq say to you, for example?
He just said, hang in there, and there's nothing you can do, things happen in someone's life.
Ron Artest didn't just play defense, he played mind games. Most players had limits, boundaries they wouldn't cross, lines drawn in permanent marker between competition and chaos. Ron Artest erased those lines with a blowtorch and a smile. Defensive Player of the Year, the man who could shut down Kobe Bryant with surgical precision, then turn around and ignite the most infamous brawl in basketball history. For 17 seasons, Artest operated in a space between genius and madness that no other player dared to explore. The Palace of Auburn Hills. November 19th, 2004. 90 seconds left in a blowout game. Artest commits a hard foul on Ben Wallace. Wallace retaliates with a shove. Any normal player would either back down or escalate. Artest, he casually strolls to the scorer's table and lies down like he's sunbathing at the beach. Then a cup flies from the stands, and basketball history changes forever. That moment didn't define Ron Artest. It revealed him, a man wired differently than everyone else who ever stepped on an NBA court. Queensbridge projects don't breed soft men. They forge survivors, and Artest survived by being unpredictable, intimidating, and absolutely unafraid of consequences. Most enforcers were all bark. Artest was all bite. He didn't need to talk tough because his reputation preceded him into every arena. Opponents knew that testing Ron Artest wasn't just risky, it was potentially career-altering. But intensity that deep cuts both ways. The same fire that made him elite also made him volatile. Every perceived slight burned hotter. Every moment of disrespect lingered longer. And when that anger crystallized into pure hatred, that's when opponents learned why crossing Ron Artest was a mistake they'd never forget. Some players irritated him, others challenged him. But 6 names transcended competition and entered something darker. Personal vendettas that outlasted careers, grudges that time couldn't heal, hatred so pure it could still surface years after retirement. These weren't basketball rivalries. They were blood feuds disguised as sports entertainment. Ron Artest kept receipts, and some debts, in his mind, could never be paid in full. Ready to meet the 6 players who earned Ron Artest's eternal hatred? But before proceeding, please take a second and subscribe, and like this video. It will be very motivation for us. It was November 19, 2004. The Indiana Pacers were up by 15 with under a minute to play, and by all accounts, the game was already over. But then came a hard foul, one that would change Ron Artest's life forever. As Ben Wallace went up for a layup, Artest reached in with a sharp body check. It wasn't a playoff game. It wasn't close. It was just a hard, late foul in a blowout, and Wallace didn't take it lightly. He turned and shoved Artest with both hands, forcefully, decisively, sending him reeling toward the baseline. That one moment sparked the most infamous brawl in NBA history. Players flooded the court. Coaches scrambled to separate bodies. Wallace was heated, furious. Artest, in what many at the time interpreted as either taunting or trying to stay calm, retreated to the scorer's table and laid down flat, his arms behind his head, staring at the ceiling. That image would haunt him. Seconds later, a drink flew from the stands. The cup, thrown by a fan named John Green, struck Artest. What followed was chaos. Artest charged into the stands. Punches flew. Fans swung back. Stephen Jackson followed Artest and got involved. Jermaine O'Neal landed a sliding punch on the floor. Players fought fans. Fans fought back. Security was overwhelmed, and in the middle of it all stood the 2 men who had sparked the flame, Ron Artest and Ben Wallace. The NBA came down hard. Artest received a record-breaking suspension, 86 games total, including 73 regular season games and 13 playoff games, the longest suspension ever handed out for an on-court incident. Wallace was suspended 6 games for his part. Years later, Artest reflected on the incident in interviews. He didn't blame it all on Wallace, but he never forgot the shove. While he's spoken about forgiveness, regret, and personal growth, some close to him have suggested he always viewed Wallace's shove as excessive, as the moment that stripped him of his season, his image, and his reputation. When Artest later made a list of players who pushed his limits, who lived in his head after the buzzer, Wallace was at the top. That night in Detroit wasn't just a footnote, it was a turning point. The Malice at the Palace lives in NBA history as a stain, a cautionary tale, and a mirror. And while the league has moved on for Ron Artest, it all began with one collision, one shove, one player, Ben Wallace. Some players got under Ron Artest's skin by talking trash, others by throwing elbows. But James Harden? He got there with a smile and a whistle. April 22nd, 2012, Lakers versus Thunder. Artest had just thrown down a dunk, hyped, emotional, pounding his chest. But in a split second, everything changed. He spun around and blasted Harden in the head with a vicious elbow. No words, no warning, just a blur of contact and a stunned silence in the arena. Harden hit the floor. Minutes later, he left the game with concussion symptoms. Artest was suspended for 7 games, a brutal penalty during the final stretch of the season, especially with the playoffs right around the corner. Later, he'd call it a bad moment, admitting he got caught up in the emotion. But the damage was done, and that elbow became one of the most infamous moments of his entire career. Fast forward to January 8th, 2013. Rockets versus Lakers. Harden dropped 31 points that night. Artest, now playing as Metta World Peace, scored 24 of his own. But something felt off. Harden wasn't just scoring, he was orchestrating, baiting defenders, drawing fouls, 8 free throw attempts, subtle movements, exaggerated contact, the kind of stuff that drove old-school defenders like Artest absolutely insane. To fans watching, it might have just looked like another big night for Harden, but for Artest, it symbolized everything that had changed, and everything he hated about that change. Defense was no longer about toughness or grit, it was about dancing around fouls and avoiding contact. Guys like Harden were winning not by overpowering defenders, but by turning their aggression against them. Artest never said Harden was his most hated opponent, but he didn't need to. The tension was there every time they shared the court. Not personal, but philosophical. Artest came from an era where contact was part of the game, where toughness was a badge of honor. Harden represented a new wave. Finesse over force, strategy over scrap, and most of all, the ability to turn defense into liability. That contrast gnawed at Artest, because it wasn't just about Harden. It was about a league that had evolved past him and left behind the players who built their legacies in the trenches. And for someone like Artest, that kind of shift cuts deeper than any elbow ever could. Some rivalries are born out of playoff wars or off-court trash talk, but with Brandon Roy, it was different. This wasn't personal, it was existential. To Ron Artest, Brandon Roy represented something he could never quite solve. A quiet killer. A player who didn't scream, didn't taunt, didn't posture. He just got to his spots and destroyed you. Roy was calm, almost too calm, and that unnerved defenders like Artest, players who thrived on chaos, confrontation, and mental warfare. Roy gave you none of that. No friction to push against, just efficiency and control. Between 2006 and 2010, Roy became the face of the Portland Trail Blazers, a 3-time All-Star, Rookie of the Year, and walking nightmare for wing defenders. He wasn't the fastest, wasn't the strongest, but he had impeccable footwork, elite basketball IQ, and a pull-up jumper that felt automatic. And against Ron Artest, he made it look too easy. In their matchups, Roy often torched Artest, not with highlight reel dunks or ankle breakers, but with surgical precision. Curl off a screen, mid-range pull-up, one dribble hesitation, finish through contact. Artest would crowd him, body him, try to throw him off rhythm, but Roy never blinked. He just kept scoring. In one game in December 2008, Roy dropped 28 on Artest's Rockets. Smooth, efficient, and unfazed. No shouting, no gestures, just buckets. Afterward, Artest told reporters, "He's one of the best players I've had to guard." Period. That wasn't praise. That was frustration wrapped in respect, because Artest didn't hate Roy the way he hated a guy like Paul Pierce. Vocal, in your face, abrasive. Roy was the opposite, a ghost in the mid-range, a problem that couldn't be solved with force or fury. And that's exactly what made him so maddening. In Artest's own words, Roy was unpredictable, a silent assassin, and too smart. For a defender like Ron, who prided himself on reading tendencies and breaking guys mentally, Roy was the rare opponent who gave him no entry point. He was too poised, too steady, and when Roy got hot, when he hit that third jumper in a row, when the crowd in Portland rose to their feet, Artest knew it was over. Not because Roy was talking trash, but because he wasn't. The ball would drop through the net, and Roy would jog back on defense, like it was a Tuesday afternoon practice. That was the part that stung the most. Years later, Artest would reflect on Roy as one of the toughest covers of his career, and while he didn't go on air saying, "I hated him," there was a clear edge in how he described those battles. Not because of anything Roy said or did, but because of how helpless he made even the best defenders feel. And for a warrior like Artest, who lived for the scrap, the grind, the tension of battle, there was no worse feeling than being outplayed by someone who made it look effortless. That wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. Because Brandon Roy didn't just beat you, he did it without ever letting you in the fight. Ron Artest had battled scorers before, but none of them were Kobe Bryant. When the Lakers met the Rockets in the 2009 Western Conference semifinals, it was billed as a chess match, elite offense versus elite defense. Artest, then in Houston, was the man tasked with doing the impossible, slowing down the Black Mamba. For 7 games, the matchup was brutal, physical, and deeply personal. Kobe averaged 27.4 points across that series. Artest played him tighter than almost anyone in the league, but it rarely seemed to matter. Kobe hit contested jumpers, he baited fouls. He moved without the ball and punished every lapse in focus. There were moments when Artest was right there, step for step, and still watched the shot go in. It wasn't just the scoring, it was the composure. Kobe had this unnerving ability to absorb intensity without ever reacting emotionally. Artest would press, bump, talk, glare, and Kobe would just lock in deeper. He didn't bite on trash talk. He didn't flail or argue. He just kept attacking. That restraint, in a way, frustrated Artest more than any move Kobe pulled on the court. They'd had their share of regular season collisions too. Across roughly 20 matchups throughout their careers, Kobe averaged 27.6 points, 6.1 assists, and 5.7 rebounds when facing Artest, numbers that barely dipped from his season averages. Artest was one of the strongest, most committed perimeter defenders in the NBA, but Kobe wasn't like the others. He didn't let you dictate the game. In Game 2 of that 2009 playoff series, tensions spilled over. Artest was ejected after confronting the officials, allegedly after he felt Kobe had thrown an elbow. It was never confirmed as intentional, and Kobe denied anything dirty. But the moment symbolized the mental toll of trying to keep pace with a player who never broke rhythm, no matter the pressure. Later, after the Lakers closed out the series in 7, Artest did something no one expected. He reached out to Kobe, told him he wanted to join the Lakers, said he was done trying to beat him. He wanted to win with him, and within months, he signed with Los Angeles. That single decision changed everything. In 2010, Kobe and Artest were teammates and champions. Artest would hit the biggest shot of his career in Game 7 of the finals that year, helping Kobe secure his 5th ring. And behind the scenes, Artest finally saw the work that made Kobe different. The pre-dawn training sessions, the obsessive film study, the relentless drive. Their relationship evolved, but Artest never forgot what it took to face Kobe. Years later, when asked about his toughest matchups, he didn't hesitate to name him. Not because Kobe ever embarrassed him, not because he ever talked down to him, but because no matter how physical the defense, no matter how intense the battle, Kobe kept finding ways to win. That's what Ron Artest hated about facing Kobe Bryant, and that's exactly why he came to respect him the most. There was tough talk in the NBA, and then there was Paul Pierce. Ron Artest didn't just face off against Pierce, he endured him. On the court, Pierce never needed a reason to start chirping. According to Artest himself, Pierce was the biggest trash talker of his era, and once even broke his tooth during a game in Boston by shoving his head to the hardwood. No foul, no camera, just pain, and Paul still talking. Their most unforgettable clash came during Game 1 of the 2003 playoffs. April 19th, Boston Garden, Celtics versus Pacers. Pierce went off for 40 points, and it wasn't just the number that stung. It was how he got there, drawing contact, baiting defenders, controlling the fourth quarter. Artest had built a reputation as one of the most physical and unshakable defenders in the league, but that night, Pierce couldn't be rattled. He'd get bumped, shoved, doubled, and he'd still hit from deep, pull up in transition, or head straight to the line. According to Sports Illustrated, Pierce scored 21 of his 40 in the fourth quarter alone, turning what had been a tight contest into a gut punch for Indiana. Artest found himself battling foul trouble down the stretch, unable to play him the way he wanted. Not physically, not freely. Pierce had turned the art of drawing fouls into a weapon, and Ron was on the receiving end. In later years, Artest would share the story of that game, but what stood out wasn't just the points, it was the disrespect, the way Pierce looked at him mid-possession, the subtle shoulder bumps, the whispers, the smirks. To Artest, it wasn't just basketball, it was psychological warfare, and the crazy part, Pierce never apologized, never tried to explain it away. That was just who he was, confident, cutting, ruthless when it mattered. Artest didn't hate Pierce because he beat him. He hated the way Pierce enjoyed doing it, the way he didn't back down even when Artest tried to turn the game into a street fight, the way he seemed to get better the more Ron pushed. They weren't built the same. Artest thrived on control. Pierce thrived on chaos. And on nights like that in 2003, when the stakes were real and the lights were bright, Ron Artest learned that some enemies don't come at you screaming. Some smile while they break you down. And to him, that made Paul Pierce even harder to forgive. When Ron Artest talked about players he hated, Stephen Jackson wasn't just on the list, he was the exception, because with Jackson, the line between teammate, rival, brother, and brawler blurred into something volatile, something explosive, something unforgettable. They didn't start out as enemies. In fact, they were side by side during the darkest chapter of Artest's career, the Malice at the Palace in 2004. When Artest charged into the stands, it was Jackson who followed him, not hesitating, not asking questions, just fists flying. The image is burned into NBA history. Jackson swinging on fans, trying to protect Artest like a soldier in battle. That night should have sealed them as blood brothers. But over time, something broke. Years later, Artest would say it plainly. Stephen Jackson punched a fan for me. He risked his whole career for me, and I loved him for that. But then, we fell out. And I can't lie, it still hurts. The reasons behind the fallout aren't all public. There are fragments, whispers from old interviews, podcast tension, passive-aggressive barbs in media appearances. Artest has said it was about loyalty, about respect, about something Jackson said behind his back. But the details still murk. What is clear is this. By the time they were both out of the league, the brotherhood was gone. And for Artest, the pain didn't come from betrayal by an opponent. It came from betrayal by someone who'd once had his back in a fight no one else dared enter. Stephen Jackson never apologized, at least not publicly. He's always stood by his choices, his words, his principles, the same way he stood by Artest in Detroit. But that stubbornness, that refusal to bend, is what eventually turned admiration into resentment. This wasn't hate born on the hardwood. It wasn't about points or elbows or blown coverages. It was personal, human, the kind of falling out that only happens when two men who once trusted each other realize they no longer do. Artest has said he still respects Jackson's game, that he'll always remember the night they stood together in the Palace. But behind that respect lies something colder, a silence that replaced brotherhood, a grudge that never fully left, in a list full of rivals, trash talkers, and enemies. Stephen Jackson was something different. He was the one who got close enough to hurt. Here we concluded this list. If you want to know the 5 players Bill Russell hated during his era, then must click the video appear on your screen. And trust me, the names might surprise you. And if you haven't already subscribed to Buckets and Battles, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment. Which player do you think Ron couldn't stand?